Today, I want to talk about Raymond Chandler's writing advice. He was a celebrated detective novelist and also a screenwriter, and his most famous work was probably The Big Sleep. That's definitely my personal favourite. So let's have a look at some of his tips for writers. Number 1, a good story cannot be devised, it has to be distilled. That's one of his most famous quotes about writing, and I can see why really. It does resonate with me. I'm all about talking about the complexity of writing, you'll know that if you've watched any of my other videos, and this quote really sums that up, I think. On paper, no pun intended, sometimes it really does seem like writing stories or writing novels is as simple as just devising the story and then getting it down. But the reality of writing, I think, is often a lot different from that. It's a slower process sometimes, it's a more complicated process, it's painstaking at times. So I think the idea of a story dripping slowly, piece by piece into existence really makes a lot of sense, and it will for a lot of other writers. And to me, that's reassuring as well. What he's basically saying here, I think, is that the story just doesn't arrive fully formed to him and then he just writes it down. It's not that simple. You just got to monitor that distillation process and just watch as the story drips through for you. That definitely makes a lot of sense to me, and hopefully it will to you as well. Number 2, I write when I can and I don't write when I can't. This, I imagine, is probably a bit of a contentious point. That is how I operate. I write when I feel like writing, and when I don't, I just don't push it. But it's easy for me to do that because I'm most of the time writing very short fiction at the moment. I'm not working on a novel that I need to get done or that I want to get done. When you are working on a novel like that, it does make sense to push through those I don't feel like writing feelings and get something done. So I suppose it does depend on exactly what you're writing as to whether you'll identify with that particular tip. A lot of writers do push through that and they're still able to produce writing that they're proud of. And to me, I'm really envious of that. I'd love to be in a position where I could do that and be that productive while still keeping the, general quality level quite high. Unfortunately for me, and probably a lot of other writers, it works the opposite way for me. If I write fewer words in a session, I tend to be happier with them. So I think this depends on your preference and how productive you like to be and how much productivity matters to you, and also what kind of project you're writing. But in general, I don't think it's bad advice at all, but I think it's very personal advice, so take it with a pinch of salt. Number 3, the actual writing is what you live for. The rest is something you have to get through in order to arrive at that point. I'm not really sure whether by the rest he means extra writing tasks like research and prep and planning, or he means the rest as in the rest of life. In either case, I'm inclined to agree. If you've been around my channel for a while, you'll probably know I'm not much for planning, I'm not much for researching either. I tend to find those things just get in the way when I'm trying to write a story, and I'll do them after the fact, if at all. But again, this is probably a preference thing, writer by writer, rather than anything else. Some people get fueled to write a story by doing that research and that planning. That's what makes them excited to finally get that perfect story down on paper. But for me, if I do all that work up front, then I feel like I've already written most of the story, even though the words aren't down, and then I lose interest in actually crafting the story piece by piece. I suppose you could look at it from a productivity standpoint as well, where it's saying the most important thing is to just write something and everything else, don't worry about it, just make sure you keep writing. And in that case, I really do agree with that. If there's one task you need to do when it comes to making your writing better, it's write. You can procrastinate all you want with little tasks that might help you become a better writer, or a more organised writer at least. But at the end of the day, you need to sit down and do the writing. That's where the main bulk of your learning and your experience is going to come from, and the main thing that will help you get better. That's certainly my opinion anyway, so I am inclined to agree with that point. Number 4, when in doubt, have a man come through the door with a gun in his hand. That's a famous piece of advice as well, and obviously we need to look at that symbolically, because not every story is going to have men with guns, although probably every story that Raymond Chandler wrote did. This, I think, will also separate the planners from the non-planners, because the planners will already know whether a man's going to come through that door with a gun in his hand or not. The non-planners, anything could happen. I tend to fall into the second camp, so a man with a gun could very well come storming into one of my stories and I'd have no idea until the point where I wrote him in. And to a large extent, I do agree with this tip. I think it helps to be unexpected, helps to surprise your readers when you're writing a story. However, I do think that man that storms in with a gun in his hand has to be 5 or maybe 10% planned at least. Otherwise, he's going to come totally out of left field and your readers aren't going to have a clue what's going on. In my opinion, you probably have to set that up at least a little bit, or you have to create a world where that could happen. Otherwise, it's not going to seem plausible and it's going to seem like you just made it up off the top of your head. which of course you did, but it shouldn't appear like that. I also think you can apply this quote to the craft of writing in general. For me personally, some of the best stories I've written, or some of the ones that I like the most, have come from absolutely nowhere. I've been writing a whole separate project, and then this new story's come in and just taken over. Creativity generally works like that, I think, or at least it does for me. I can't decide when it's going to arrive or how long it's going to stay, so I better write that story while it's still around. What I take from that is to leave the door ajar a little, so that man with a gun can come through and give me a new story, rather than locking him out and closing myself off to that possibility. Number 5, technique alone is never enough. You have to have passion. Technique alone is just an embroidered pot holder. I really like this quote, and it may not surprise you because I talk about passion in writing fairly often in my videos, and I think it's got to be the driving force behind whatever story you're telling. I agree with him. Technique alone cannot sustain an entire story, not a short story, and definitely not a novel. Nice writing for the sake of nice writing might impress other writers in the short term, but it won't keep a reader interested for pages and pages of your work. That passion, I agree, has to be there, has to be what prompted your story in the first place, and it has to be what you're following through the duration of writing it. Of course, you can use that technique even in the first draft of your story and write it as nicely as possible, as long as that passion is still there, because technique can't replace it. It can just become the gilded edges of a story that already matters. Once you've figured out what that passion is that's driving your story, and I've made tons of videos about this, you don't have to change the world with the message of your story. It just has to be something specific that you can follow through until you've written the whole thing. Once you've got that, you can absolutely apply those techniques or go back and correct them or fine-tune them, but I think the driving force always has to be the passion, so I strongly agree with that one. Number 6, the challenge is to write about real things magically. That's a great quote, I think. It's a very complicated subject boiled down to a very easy to digest message. That quote, I think, speaks to me more than any of the other quotes, and I find that it aligns with my view of writing more than anything else. Stories have to have actions and events and things happening and people going places, but on top of that, to make a story feel whole, in my opinion, you have to have that magic. And to me, that's not about making things grand or unbelievable. It's about finding those little moments that carry weight in everyone's life that maybe we don't have a name for, and just weaving that into your story on top of those actions and events. And when he says real things, I don't take that as a comment on genre whatsoever. He's not saying you can't write fantasy or sci-fi because those aren't real things or real places or whatever. I think he's talking about people. Those real things he's talking about are happening to people, their experiences, the human condition, because there is no story without people. No matter what genre you write in, it's always about people. I've read quite a few of Raymond Chandler's books, and they are about real things. They're people opening cigarette packets, they're people having drinks, they're people driving places, but he always has that element of magic on top, which is what makes the stories rich and what makes you keep turning the page time and time again. I thought about this magic before when it comes to my own writing, and it really has driven me to write some better stories than when I just thought, what could happen in this story? What could happen is just the platform. The magic has to be on top, otherwise it's not going to feel like a complete story, or it's not going to be all of the story that it could be. So I definitely agree with that point as well. If you take nothing else from this video, I'd encourage you to try and do that. Add a little bit of magic to your writing and see what happens. As always, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.